Hi everyone, this is Victoria teaching digital design at OCAD, and for today's lesson wanted to introduce you to Rhino 7 Rhino 7's interface, and just note that this will be running on the Windows or PC kind of side of things, so if you're using a Mac it's going to look a little bit different, but hopefully most of what I'm going to show you today is pretty relevant. Just some of the buttons might be off to the side. But to start off, this is the main screen you would open up to if you just started Rhino. If you ever want to start new, you go to File, New. And from here, by default, you'll be introduced to a series of files that you can open up. They're basically templates, and the main thing to consider is the unit of measurement, whether you're using imperial or metric. For imperial, you'll tend to use inches, and for metric, at least in architecture, you'll lean towards millimeters. So I would typically pick either large object inches or large object millimeters. So for today, I'm just going to choose large object inches. I'm going to select that and then hit open. So then here you are. So to explain the interface a little bit, you have 4 screens right here, and what that is it's kind of a viewport, right? So you see here top, perspective, front, and right. So these are multiple views. As you know, in architecture, there's multi-view drawing, and to describe an object, you need multiple faces to describe the object. So typically, we'll have the top, front, and right view to describe the faces of an object, and then in perspective, we can begin to see how that all comes together. So the way to activate a screen is to click on it, and then when you see it's blue, that means that you've kind of made it the active viewport, let's say. So now I click perspective. I'm using a mouse, so I would highly recommend it. If you don't use a mouse already, make sure you go grab one that has a left click, a right click button, as well as a wheel, a scroll wheel, right? So the main reason I think it's useful is that you click on a viewport, and then using your scroll wheel, you can zoom in and out. If you don't have that function, you'd have to type in zoom and use it as a command, right? So it kind of adds another layer of difficulty in navigation, which is easily solvable by getting a mouse. So if you don't have one right now, it's okay, but try to get one as soon as you can. Just like a cheap plug-in mouse will do, and that will help you get much more familiar with the programs. So yeah, highly recommend getting a mouse. Yeah, so from there, you just click and activate the viewport. Note that you can double-click a viewport, and then it will be the sole viewport that you are seeing. You can also double-click it again, and then you're back to your 4 screens, right? So a couple different ways that you can set that up. And obviously, say I can click on the top viewport, zoom in and out with my wheel. But right now it doesn't really matter because we don't have any object drawn. Now on the top, as I mentioned, you can type out different commands, right? So this is what's called the command line. If you're using a Mac, it'll be on the top or to the left side here, and it won't look like this entire length of the screen, but it will be on the top left sidebar. So what the command line does, there's a couple ways that you can begin performing actions in Rhino. On one hand is the command line. It's very much like AutoCAD. You can type in the command that you want to use. So as you start typing, it will start giving you some suggestions. So I can type extrude, and then there's a lot of different extrude commands. So that's the thing with Rhino. There's a ton of different commands. Part of the learning curve is just learning all the commands that are out there and how to use them and in what cases, right? So I'm going to try to introduce you to a couple today. But just to start off, one of the commands, very common, would be called a polyline. So you type that in, polyline, and then you always have to hit enter. That activates the command. So now you can read the command line. It says start of polyline. So I'm going to go to my top view. I'm going to click. And then to make a line, you got to click a second point. So I'm just going to click anywhere here. And then that's good. I'm going to just click on the bottom here. And then we're just going to hit enter to escape. So you can always select the object by clicking it. Notice how even though there's two lines, it's connected. So that's the key thing with the polyline. Rather than having two separate segments, polylines are always connected in a closed loop as long as you created it in one continuous command. The other way that you can activate the polyline command is actually at the button right here. So right under the mouse, if you left click that, you can start a polyline. So when you look at the command line, it still gives you the same action, right? So they're basically equivalent, and then I can click, and then I'll hit enter, and then we have a couple different polylines right here. So if you hover over a bunch of these right here, it's called a ribbon, you'll be able to see the various different actions that you can take. So you can hover over here, and then you'll see if you left click, you can start a control point curve. Right click is a curve through points. Also note that if there's a bottom right arrow, you can click that, and then it will have a panel that pops out, and then there are additional commands that you can choose from. So I won't go through every single command. You can kind of look through that on your own time and kind of hover over and see what they do. But I'll kind of run through some of the important ones to kind of complete a drawing for today. So overview, on the left hand side you have the ribbon, which has a bunch of actions that you can click on. Second option is the command line, and the difficulty is learning the commands at the moment. You don't know what exactly to type, so if you just follow along with the tutorials, I'll be telling you what command to type in, so that will be easy. But yeah, continue to learn, educate yourself with the different commands that are in Rhino. And my personal preference is the command line, just because it's often a little difficult to find where exactly that button is. It's easier to remember what that command is and then simply type it out. So, if you can get comfortable to that point, I would recommend using command line. Okay, so from there, I'm going to go to the bottom here, right? So on the bottom, you'll see a bunch of boxes that say end, near, point, mid, center, intersection, perpendicular, tan, quad, not, vertex. If you're in a Mac, I believe these are on the left-hand side, right below your buttons in your ribbon. So look for those words. But basically, these are all your snapping points. And that's this button right here called Osnap. So make sure it's bolded. I typically want it on. And the reason for that is, let's just check endpoint, midpoint, intersection, perpendicular for now, right? So make sure those are checked. And then when you have a couple of those checked, make sure your Osnap is bolded. That means it's active. And by that, I mean I'm going to type in polyline. Then I'm going to hit enter. So the reason why snapping is important is, say I want to create a line that perfectly matches and touches the vertex of this curve. And I want that because I want to create a closed curve that kind of loops together and creates a shape. So let's say I want to enclose this from point to point to create a triangle. Notice how when I hover over a point it says end? That means it's snapping right at that point. And it's critical, as I said, because we want to close that shape. So let's do that. Let's click the end, and then let's hover over the next vertex, and it's also snapping to the endpoint. Click that, and then hit enter to escape. Now we have two lines right here, right? So to connect these lines, you'll want to click one, press and hold shift, click the second line, and then you can release shift now, and then type in the command join, and then enter. Notice how in the command line it now says two curves joined into one closed curve. Right? And let's just say I have Osnap on, or Osnap off. So I turned it off, now it's not bold. And now I'm going to type in polyline, hit enter. And then now I'm going to go over the vertex. I don't have my snaps on. I'm just going to approximate it, right? End to end. There. Hit enter, escape. Now I have two lines. From this view, it looks like they're connected, right? No problem. So I'm going to press and hold shift, click the second line, and then I'm going to type in join, enter. And now it says unable to join curves. So why is that? Let's zoom in a little. Notice that they are close, but they're not touching. And that's the exact problem that I mentioned. You can only be sure that they are touching if you have the Osnap on. So it's critical to know when you turn that on and off. For whatever reason, you might want it off because you don't want them to touch. But more often than not, you do want them on. So I'm just going to click on that curve, type in delete. You can also use the delete key on your keyboard. And I'm going to click Osnap again. So now it's bold, it's turned on. Make sure that end point is checked off. So these are all the snapping points. If I uncheck it, then it will not snap to end. So make sure that is still checked off. And then I'm going to type polyline, enter. And then now, if I click end to end, hit enter. Let's say I selected both lines, typed in join, enter. And then it says two curves joined into one open curve. So when it says open curve, that means it's not a closed loop. So let me look. Okay, somewhere along the way, I guess I didn't snap correctly here. Right? So that would be a problem as well. So we can fix that by typing explode, enter. Now these are all separate curves. I can click this and delete. I'll type in polyline. Let's try that again. So endpoint, endpoint, enter. And then I'm going to press and hold shift, select all the lines. Now I'm going to type join, enter. Three curves joined into one closed curve. And the closed or open curve concept is really important when it comes into the 3D modeling. It'll be the difference between having a solid object and a planar open 3D model. So for example, if you had a cylinder, it'd be the difference of having like a solid cylinder with fully enclosed or having an open cylinder without the top and bottom faces. So I'll get into the importance of this a little bit more when we jump into 3D, but for now, just know that it's important to make sure your snaps are on, make sure that your endpoints touch, your lines are meeting correctly. And try to always have closed curves for the most part. All right, so next on the bottom here is the ortho command. I like to have that checked off when you're drawing floor plans, especially if you're doing the grids. So notice I'm going to click here. And then it's restricting me to drawing vertically, horizontally, so it's forcing you to stick to the X and Y axis. And it's really good to have when you're drawing rectilinear objects, like a grid plan or that kind of thing. So you can always check this on and off. But ortho is nice to have. You'll see me switch it on and off as I draw a couple things in this tutorial today. Smart track, I like to have that on as well. It's kind of like a reference point. So for example, I'm going to draw a point here. Let's say I want to draw a horizontal line that meets to this point. So I can hover over it. Notice how my mouse turns gray. And then I have ortho on, so it's forcing me to draw horizontally for the most part. And notice how now, like, I'm hovering really close to that reference point that I hovered over. And now there's this gray line. So it's kind of snapping to that point. And what that means is if I click here, hit enter, I know that this horizontal line is perfectly aligned with the point right here that I referenced, right? So it's good to have when you're, say I'm drawing a rectangle here, and then say I want this length to be the same to create a rectangle, so I have that, right? So Smart Track allowed me to reference that point, create a horizontal line the same length, and then if I hover over the final point to create a loop, the command automatically knows to exit because I've created a closed loop. So now if you click on that, you can see that it's one closed curve added to selection. Next there's Gumball. This is more of like a 3D tool. I'll jump into that at a later point, but this is kind of a nice command to have later, but I won't talk about that today. And then lastly, in terms of the interface, I want to introduce you to this on the right hand side. So default on the left here is properties. So if you click on an object, it'll tell you the properties. It's an open curve. The layer is default, display color, all those kind of things. So you might want that. Typically, I like to leave it at layers. So this is a pie-shaped icon. And layers are incredibly important for organization of your model. So by default, you have, the default layer, then you have layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you hover over the intersection of this panel and your viewports, you'll see a cursor with arrows. You can, drag it to make it smaller. You can drag it to make it larger, just so you see more of the panel. So again, it's important to have layers as you begin to organize things. So when it comes to floor plans, it's important to have various layers to introduce various line mates. So you want like section cuts maybe to be on one layer, and then you want so in a floor plan, in that case, it would be like walls on one layer. Maybe you want furniture on its own layer because you want it to be like super faint. Maybe you want doors and windows all in one layer. Begin to, develop a structure of organization that relates to the line weights and how you begin to think about how you're going to print this at the end. And the way you can double click to make it an active layer. So right now, default is my active layer because it has the check mark, and that's why everything I draw will be on the default layer. If I double click layer 1, anything I draw now, type in polyline. I'm going to go back to my top. Notice how everything is red now because I made layer 1 the active layer. Now you can click the layer name, and then you can always rename it. So I'm going to call it, you know, doors or something, right? So then you can have um, separate layers for that. You can also change the line type, if you want this is to be above, for example. You can change this to be a dashed line. Print width, so this is when you introduce line weights, so maybe your walls, they're kind of showing what's cut, so you want that thicker, and then doors, maybe you want that lighter. Maybe you have this layer as furniture, and you make that super light, super faint, for example, hairline. So that's the kind of thing. Rendering, typically I don't render in Rhino. We'll use a plugin, so wouldn't worry about that. So that's kind of it. So I mainly concern myself on this side with properties and layers. So I think that's it for the interface. Hopefully this was a helpful tutorial, and next video will cover drawing a 2D plan in Rhino. Alright, see you then.